start recording. Thank you.
Yeah.
How long is it? Or if you minimize it.
You want to start or you have more to say?
No,
As a convener.
I'll short.
Okay. So thanks everyone for coming. I know these are not the best days because classes are over, etc. So I expected much less people, but I'm happy you're all here. Thank you. This was a really good exercise for me because my thesis is really sprawling and I had to present it in a concise manner. Anton gave me generously 45 minutes. I'll do my best, but I don't promise anything. And I start my timer so I know where I am. Okay. So that's the title of my thesis. Timer is started. Okay. So what I'm actually studying is processes of subjectivation within Greece's housing property regime. And this is the reason behind that. In Greece, after the Second World War, generalized homeownership was the main pillar of informal welfare. I'll explain what I mean by that, and of government of the population. Today, austerity and reforms lead to housing dispossession and a severe housing crisis that affects many different parts of the population in different ways. Yet, there is no vocal housing movement that could present resistances. This is a paradox. And I attribute this to the persistence of popular imaginaries of rent-seeking and real estate speculation that prevent still housing from being framed as a social right. To explore this paradox, I examine how subjects have been created around property relations historically, on one hand, and contemporary attempts at defending, resisting, or renegotiating current property relations by focusing on emerging conflicts around property relations. So my research questions come from this paradox. Why are there no housing movements when Greece has the gravest housing crisis in Greece? And so I go back to study the policies, narratives, and practices, formal and informal, that have been shaping the Greek housing property regime. I'll explain what this is in a second. What is a conception of value promoted by it? And why and how have processes of social formation around property been evolving over time? And what are the ways in which subjects have been resisting and defending or renegotiating dominant property relations and relations of exploitation? First, about me. I inhabit many different subject positions, exactly like the subjects that I'm interested in. So for like biographical accidents, I am a tenant, I'm not a homeowner, despite being a member of the lower middle class. This is not very typical in my cohort, let's say in Greece. So I have first-hand experience of the breakdown of the housing property regime in Greece. I am, of course, a white lower middle class family man. I stress family because you will see that family, the experience of family is very central to welfare in Greece and also to homeownership. So I have a relatively privileged condition where I can see things from the inside. At the same time, I am a researcher from a peripheral country in a European institution, which somehow often I feel obliged to set the record straight on various prevalent ideas, both in the academia and the media, about Greece. And most importantly, I come from a lifelong commitment to movements for social change. I'm a latecomer to the academia. I'm too old for some to start a PhD, but I have transitioned from writing for the social movements into academic writing very slowly. And this is the culmination of this process. But still, my commitment is with the process of social change, and this is evident in my writing. How do I study this? It's a mixed methodology. Discourse analysis, post-structural discourse analysis is my main tool and method. especially in the way that discourse shapes the subject. I use some ethnographic tools, although by no means is this an ethnography that I have produced, like partisan observation, interviews, digital ethnography, etc. And the retroductive method, which is a method of constantly going back and forth between like the construction of plausible, falsifiable models of why things are happening, and the field where I meet with practitioners, with social movement activists, with other academics, where I put these ideas into testing. So, property. Property is a socio-legal institution that underpins processes of identity formation around race, class, and gender formation, and statecraft and citizenship in all liberal polities. One specific case is Greece, which I'm going to go in a second. But it is propriety, the adoption of appropriate subject positions that regulates access to property. Property is inseparable from processes of subject formation, from adoption of specific dispositions, values, behaviors. I jump onto housing because housing has a central place in capitalism. Housing is not only a place where social production takes place, but also it's really enmeshed within systems of welfare in various ways, especially in the neoliberal idea of asset-based welfare, where state welfare is dismantled in favor of the acquisition of asset appreciating, value appreciating assets such as housing. But also housing is a site of capital accumulation in itself, the famous spatial fix described by David Harvey, where when there are no possibilities of profitability in other sectors, capital is funneled into the construction and real estate sectors. And this leads to the financialization of housing, where every aspect of construction and distribution of housing is mediated by big financial organizations, be they banks or speculative funds. And of course, the private rental sector, touristification, short-term rentals are emerging new conflicts around housing. But also importantly for me, housing is a vector of subjectivation, as home ownership reinforces the ideologies of private property, investment, and accumulation, and ties individuals to the dynamics of capital, such as wage labor and debt, and supports new modes of citizenship, as we will see further down, around debt and finance. Housing also is a place of inequalities, old and new and emerging. So how do I approach the subject? I start from Foucault's, I'm inspired by Foucault and his affirmation that capitalism would not have been possible without the controlled insertion of bodies into the machinery of production and the adjustment of the phenomenon of population to economic processes, but also by rendering this subject available and docile without making them more difficult to govern. So capitalism requires subjects attuned to its processes of production in order to operate. It's not only imposed from without, but also from within. And Lazzarato adds to this that the central project of capitalist politics consists in the articulation of economic, technological, and social flows with the production of subjectivity in such a way that political economy is identical with subjective economy. Guattari phrased it like this: capitalism launches subjective models the way the automobile industry launches a new line of cars. In my thesis, these are two different strands that come together: political economy on the one hand of the housing property regime in Greece, and subjective economy on the other hand. But here I weave them together for the needs of this presentation. At each moment in time, power attempts to mold subjects attuned to the dominant mode of accumulation. What is a mode of accumulation? A historically contingent and shifting configuration of productive forces, relations of production, social relations, and institutional arrangements that together determine how surplus value is produced, appropriated, and distributed. So value changes its meaning according to where we are, which is the dominant mode of accumulation. Two processes are important for me when I study the subject. On the one is a top-down process and the other one is a bottom-up process, let's say roughly. One is the subject position offered by power. So individuals acquire an identity of who they are by being positioned in certain ways by a whole series of discourses, practices, rituals, customs, and beliefs which they come to identify with. Through discourse, power interpellates individuals to identify with the dominant subject position. This is the subject of value, the subject of propriety, of property, of social mobility. This is commensurate with the dominant ways of creating wealth for capitalism. The subject of value is attuned to the dominant conception of value in a specific mode of accumulation. And this is the carrot, apart from the stick that capitalism would use. So if you adopt the subject positions and you, of course, you possess the appropriate class and gender characteristics, you will be the socially mobile subject, potentially having access to wealth accumulation within any society. So the hardworking, responsible, self-interested, wealth-generating subject of value is always constructed against its outside. You have to create the opposite first that unites what is inside. And this is the class opposite, those who destroy value, who are parasitic, who are dependent, who waste resources, who are unproductive. This changes in its historical era. So the second process that I'm interested in is political subjectivation. Let's say that this is a bottom-up process. The subject, of course, is a product of discursive structures, but at the same time possesses agency, a capacity for decision. Identification is never complete, it's never monolithic. Each individual simultaneously occupies multiple subject positions. So there come some times where discursive structures cannot explain some things. There are some events that cannot be accommodated. They cannot be explained. And these are moments of dislocation. Suddenly, everything comes loose, and this is a moment of possibility. And subjects are called to re-identify. There is a struggle at this moment for identification. And this is the moment for the subject to exercise its agency, the moment of political subjectivation. Both processes are important for me in this thesis, but on different parts of the thesis. So my argument, the first part of my argument, after the Second World War in Greece, the power endeavored to shape subjectivity around property relations. So housing became an instrument of government rather than more simple access to shelter. The specific dominant mode of accumulation created specific subject positions. And in each era, this was the proper middle class, socially mobile subject position, which was constructed against its constitutive outside, the useless subject, the wasteful, dependent, unprotective subject. But first, before I go to this process of subjectivation, I'm going to go to the roots of the Greek housing property regime. A housing property regime is a set of market mechanisms, legal provisions, and moral discourses that condition access to and use of housing property. After World War II and the bloody civil war that ensued in Greece, the country was reconstructed not like in the rest of Europe through state expenditure and housing reconstruction by the state, but through two informal mechanisms. First, by assisted self-construction, whereby the state would help people literally build their own homes by providing them cheap materials or like blueprints. And then in the 50s, through the mid-50s onwards, through the system of land for flats swap. So the owner of a small urban plot, who sometimes previously was a squatter or who built illegally there, maybe 20 years ago, suddenly could exchange the small urban plot for give it to a constructor. The constructor would build a high-rise, a polykatikia, and the small property owner would take some flats, some modern flats back. So this was also an operation of class construction, because the small peasant, the displaced, the refugee who would come to the urban center around the 40s, by the 60s could be the owner of multiple flats to live in, to rent out, to give to their children. This allowed, the inexistence of town planning and the tolerance to legal construction were integral to the system, were not some byproduct or afterthought. This allowed the state to have very, very low social expenditure and no housing policies at all. The cheap access to homeownership was the one-size-fits-all solution to housing problems. So this is the center of Athens in the 1860s. And 100 years ago, you see all these white buildings. These are the polykatikias intermixed with the previous structures. These were coveted. Everyone wanted one of these. These were synonymous to modernization, to social advancement, to belonging to the middle class. Here you can see that both mechanisms of production of space. This is the self-constructed housing, which is gradually being demolished to give way to the modern polykatikias that are there. And this is today's landscape. This is the urban jungle of Greece. This is a very characteristic place. There has been no urban planning at all, no provision for common facilities, for parks, for anything. Every inch of urban land has been turned into cheap, accessible flats in order to generalize homeownership. Why generalize homeownership? Because homeownership became a basic pillar of a system of informal welfare. To adapt to to a system of rapid industrialization and growth that found its competitive advantage there in cheap labor, low investment, and zero social expenditure. So individualism and familism were integral to this. Find your own way to improve your life. Homeownership was one of them. There are some other that I note here. So let's go to the actual process of subjectivation. This whole process needed the creation of a subject. The one family flat became a universal aspiration, as I told you, and the quasi-developmental mode of accumulation required the creation of a new subject, which was the νοικοκυρέος, the householder. This was done by emulating the ways of the petit bourgeoisie, of the craftsmen, of the merchants, of the petty entrepreneurs of the times, even though most people were workers. But the culture of the petit bourgeoisie became dominant, so that meant being conservative. We're talking about the end of the Civil War, a concept of Cold War anti-communism, nationalist, home-owning, family man, individualistic, minding his own business, accumulating wealth for himself without any provision for the social good. This kind of propriety gave access to property. So this had to be constructed in the media and in all the sources that I study against its opposite, which was the communist, in a context of anti-communism. This was violent, mentally unstable, lazy, undeserving. These are the depictions of the communism. Importantly, this was the one who threatened to take away this newfound source of prosperity, the home, because the communists were supposed to come in power and collectivize housing and whatnot. So these were the dominant narratives back then. In this period, many demands for redistribution and for social justice emerge. And when they cannot be suppressed politically anymore, a dictatorship comes to power in 1967 to suppress them, up until 1974. In 1974, the dictatorship falls and there is a transition to democracy. So demands for equality, redistribution resurface. But this is an environment of recession, industrialization, slowdown of construction. A socialist populist project comes to power, emerging from this delayed desire for reform. This is an alliance between workers and women's movements, the self-employed, petty entrepreneurs, and the educated new middle class that is employed in the state and in the private sector. And the socialist project privileges a mode of accumulation based on state-directed economic activity, national independence, protectionism, and importantly, the development of small and medium-sized enterprises. So a new subject position should be put forth as a socially mobile subject. The micromeseos, which means small and medium-sized, and links traditional petit bourgeois concerns with demands for social justice. Initially, this was referring to small and medium-sized businesses, but then it came to refer to anyone who was not a part of the privileged classes. And precisely the constitutive outside in this era is the privileged, anyone having an unfair advantage due to their favored relationship with the establishment, who are undeserving, cronies, feeding off the hard labor of the common people. All the rest, those lacking privilege, farmers, workers, women, craftsmen, petty entrepreneurs, educated professionals, were unified into an undifferentiated people. This is the essence of populism. But due to the economic recession, this project could not go very far. And in the 1990s, we have a neoliberal reform, which was espoused by both parties in the two-party system. And this is the end of the big construction era. Real estate prices are rising very rapidly. Real wages, however, with the neoliberal reforms of the era, remain stagnant or fall. But mass consumption is maintained through bank credit, what is called in the bibliography privatized Keynesianism. The main project of the era is modernization. Pragmatism, liberalism, technocracy, and reform against what they perceive as populism, state dependence, mediocrity, clientelism. And a new dominant mode of accumulation emerges through the consolidation of large domestic corporations in specific sectors, and importantly, the deregulation of the financial sector, which was previously in the hands of the state. So the new buzzwords are investment, entrepreneurship, risk-taking, economic efficiency. And the new subject position put forth by power to inhabit this is the petty investor, who is risk-taking, entrepreneurial. You see it in television ads, in newspaper articles of the era. Calculative, pragmatic, he leaves behind the conflicts of the past in favor of love of freedom, self-responsibility, flexibility. 680,000 households placed their money in Athens stocks market in the 90s. This is astounding number, and most of them lost it. The banks, they are the new protagonists. They advertise cheap credit for all. They're recently deregulated, and the interest rates are very, very low. So everyone's called on to seize opportunity. Who is the constitutive outside? Who is the villain of this era? The villain of this era is the protagonist of the previous era. All those who are uncompetitive and unproductive, the petty entrepreneurs who are sticking to traditional ways of production, the state bureaucracy, traditional low investment and protected sectors, and of course the favorite villains of neoliberalism, the trade unions. Suddenly, after everyone is called to invest in property, seizing opportunity and taking on debt, a few years after that, the housing bubble collapses and there's a huge non-performing loan crisis. 1 in every 2 debtors is in arrears. The national debt crisis is resolved through the avenue of internal devaluation, which means that we cannot devalue our currency to get out of financial trouble. We devalue everything else. We devalue wages, pensions, welfare provisions. So it's a drastic reduction of the standards of living of the population that happens in very, very little time. It's like a seismic shift. The housing bubble bursts, and a set of reforms gradually, slowly, starts to invite big hedge funds to speculate in the distressed real estate market. When the prices start to pick up again, the big actors have to place themselves in the market. Initially, all the over-indebted homeowners, which is 1 out of 2 households in Greece, they are spared the repossession of their homes, like the one that happened in Spain and Ireland exactly in the same years, because somehow housing is considered important for the stability of the system or maintaining social peace. So there are some frameworks that offer them favorable renegotiations. In this time, the dominant mode of accumulation is accumulation by dispossession. You have processes of extractivism and land grab, which were previously reserved for the colonialized countries. They're imported in the European periphery. You have fire sale privatization of all state assets. You have housing repossessions, and of course you have debt repayment, which is a very specific kind of dispossession. From 2015, a severe housing crisis, the worst according to statistics in the whole of the European Union, starts. The rapidly rising real estate prices after the bubble burst, along with stagnant incomes, creates a huge unaffordability crisis. Access to home ownership is totally blocked. There is no bank credit for the average household. They're not credit worthy. The families do not have the real estate prices are totally disconnected from people's incomes, and the family, whose traditional role is to help new generations into home ownership, has been totally dispossessed through the austerity measures. The rate of home ownership drops drastically by 10 percentage points in 15 years, and the property taxes sextuple. Tenants are the most impacted category. The rents rise by 80% from 2050 to the present day, and they face the highest housing cost overburden rate in the European Union. And invisible populations, which, like another aspect that I'm interested in, are rendered displaceable. This is the time, of course, of the refugee crisis in the EU, where people are totally dehumanized in camps. And also the Roma population is facing a new process of dispossession, and they live in like makeshift homes. In this context, what is presented as housing policies are actually exactly the opposite. They're measures designed to reheat the distressed market, and thus they exacerbate the crisis by raising prices. So a new subject is required. We don't need anymore the petty entrepreneur who has the freedom-loving spirit that will go forward with it by his own self-initiative. With accumulation by dispossession, the subject of value is the one that accepts its own dispossession as fair and as reasonable. All the previous sources of identity, home ownership, industriousness, consumption, entrepreneurialism, they're invalidated. There's no promise of prosperity anymore. There's only promise of not being further dispossessed and devalued. So the subject has to accept its moral and economic bankruptcy and commit to a lifetime of atonement through debt repayment. And the new villain is the strategic defaulter. Those who default on the debts, even though they have the capacity to pay. And this is a discourse that takes hold, especially after 2015, to justify the repeal of all measures that offered debt relief or that protected the homes of the people from repossession. So by this discourse, some strategic defaulters, some people take advantage of the debt relief. This presents a moral hazard because it invites people to stop paying their debts. So all debt relief should be repealed. A systemic failure, thus, the NPL crisis, is individualized and is moralized, is attributed to the individual morality. So, my argument, property is still structuring social relations in Greece and stratification, but is now inaccessible for a large part of the population. What I mean is that there were two main pillars of social mobility in Greece traditionally. One was home ownership, and the other one was university education in order to get middle-class jobs and advance intergenerationally in social mobility. One is now foreclosed because even if you get university education and even if you get a job despite the high unemployment, a middle-class job right now, after the process of internal devaluation, does not guarantee an acceptable standard of living. What does guarantee an acceptable standard of living? Owning property. Owning property as a homeowner. If you don't have to pay rent, you can make ends meet. If you have to pay rent, you cannot make ends meet. But importantly, owning property that to rent out. this is the mark of middle classness today. And this door to property ownership has been closed for the bulk of the population. The traditional foundation of social coherence and political hegemony in Greece, which is property-based middle-class affluence, is thus destabilized. What keeps social cohesion? What keeps the population together? What is the promise of working for the system, believing in the system? I term this post-welfare government that has various components. One is debt. Debt is a way of taking relations of exploitation and naturalizing them and legitimating them, making them seem as relations of exchange, of free exchange between equals. And in this case, using the guilt associated to debt, you ensure that people remain disciplined and remain working in order to repay their debts. But also there's another process. These are different strands of theory. The debt is mainly Lazzarato. Then is precarization, which is offered by Isabelle Lorey. This is a process of constantly lowering the standard of living for the entire population, regardless of whether they belong in the core of the population or in the margins of the population. This is putting people in a process of perpetual competition for scarce resources. And of course, the last resort is always authoritarianism, either authoritarian and repressive ways of government or authoritarianism that comes from below, that is authoritarian subjectivations around traditional values and traditional models such as nationalism, racism, etc. I should have gone more into this, but I don't have the time. New value struggle front lines emerge around these restructured property relations. So what I want to do is explore these relations of exploitation and the resistance that arises and the new forms and dimensions that it acquires. So now I move from, remember there is subject positions, roles offered by power for people to identify, and then there is the people's agency, their capacity to renegotiate, identify or not identify. And this is what I call subjectivation around property. So I have studied through various methods, mainly discourse analysis, but also interviews, participant observation, digital ethnography, etc. 5 groups of people around the restructured property relations in Greece. They are differentially positioned, they have different interests, and they construct their identities and the identities of their rivals in a different manner. Landlords, they're the net winners of the restructured property relations, more so than ever in Greek history. In their discourses, especially through internet forums and through interviews with their associations, they construct the tenants, they construct themselves as the subjects of value. We are the ones who create value in society. We offer a service to society. We offer housing. No one else does. We are expected to accommodate the special needs of the tenants while the state has no housing policies. We work hard to pay taxes, to maintain our properties. They construct tenants as the useless subject, the subject that wastes resources, destroys value. They are the ones who are infantile. They don't know what they want. They want too much. They are totally unreal in their expectations. They leave our homes trashed. They don't pay their rent. They don't pay the building fees. They want to take advantage of us, the good landlords that create this service. For landlords, the outcomes of the market are not subject to moral evaluations. The market is just a neutral instrument of assigning resources. Everything that comes out of market transactions is just normal and legitimate. So we should not interfere with the market. This is only fair, and if we interfere with the market, we're going to make things worse rather than better. What is morality for them? Morality is holding your end of the deal in market transactions, not evaluating what the market is producing as an outcome. Tenants, also through internet forums, but I have to disclose that during the course of this research, along with friends, we have started our own union of tenants, which is something new in Greece. There is no precedent of a union of tenants. So we approached this lack of housing movements in Greece, deciding to create, as equals, participate in this debate and in this struggle, and create a new voice informed by our academic research and by our findings. So this is all over my thesis, really. This is quite central to how this thesis is framed. It's informed by my own action within the tenant union. So tenants construct themselves as subjects of value. Why? They're hardworking, they're diligent, they always pay on time. They have to take on 2 jobs to pay their rent, despite being like single mothers or like valuable populations, and they always pay their debts. They add value to society. This is the discourse. The landlords, on the other side, are constructed as the useless subject, the subject who is parasitic. The most common critique being, okay, they have like inherited a couple of old flats from their grandmother, and they think that they can expect this kind of income from these flats. They do nothing. They sit on their ass all day, and they just feed off the labor of other people. For tenants, the market outcomes are subject to more evaluation. The market is not neutral. So that's why they support intervention in the market. So another category that is central and that is new in these restructured property relations is the over-indebted homeowners. Remember, 1 out of 2 households. Some lost their homes, some are still in the process of fighting for them, some have achieved renegotiation of their debt, but all of them share a condition that they planned for a totally different outcome with totally different economic conditions. And suddenly their incomes were slashed and they could not repay their debts. And now they're slaves to these debts. A lot of their income goes to this, and a disproportionate part of their income goes to this debt. So they construct themselves as subjects of value. I was hardworking, I was entrepreneuring, I was the investor subject, I invested in my future. Outside forces are to blame. And what is outside forces? The banks. The banks are the useless subject. They sub society's wealth and energy. However, an interesting finding is that unlike tenants, to an extent, the tenants are now being politicized. The over-indebted homeowners, despite this huge problem that they had, they did not accept collective demands and collective action. Most of them were in favor of individual solutions to their specific problem. And this is why the anti-eviction movement, such as the PA in Spain, never took hold in Greece, because most of these people are still in the individualistic mindset of the νοικοκυρέως, of after the post-Second World War subject position of individual wealth accumulation and appropriation and disregard for the common good. And another group that I felt that I needed to include, because they have been articulating the most consistent and radical critique of the Greek housing property regime, are squatters. Squatters do not construct themselves as subjects of value. They don't say, we deserve to live in these homes because we work hard, we produce value for society. They frame themselves as subject of values. And this is another interesting distinction I want to make in my thesis between values and value, which for me it's not an entirely different thing. I'm using like Graeber's anthropological theory of value to justify this. So we as squatters were the subjects of solidarity, were the subjects of care, were the subjects of camaraderie. And this is what makes us valuable to society, not the fact that we produce value for the system. Property for the squatters is not part of the solution. It's not that we will all become homeowners again, so everything will be solved. It's part of the problem because it cultivates imaginaries of micro-speculation in the middle classes, which is at the root of processes of exploitation. And what is exploitation? The big picture in Greece right now is that since 2010 to this day, incomes and the standards of living have been constantly falling gradually. The internal devaluation has been going on 15 years after it started. Every day is a bit worse for everyone. And this is because one aspect of exploitation in Greece is the exploitation in favor of the international financial system, which through national debt repayment and private debt repayment, repossessions of homes, and the transfer of the NPL problem to the hedge funds that are investing in Greece, they have been sapping wealth out of Greece. But also there's another aspect of exploitation because internal class relations are also becoming more tense. New conflicts are arising. The tenant-landlord conflict is relatively new in Greece. It has happened like in previous decades, but not for a long time. And labor exploitation, of course, has become much more intensive. Now, what I'm arguing here is that we should, like more traditional Marxists would say that these are not exploitation. Exploitation happens at the workplace. The rent, debt, etc., are just recycling value that is generated in some other place. I want to give the big picture by arguing that value is not just produced in transactions in the capitalist market and in the workplace with the extraction of surplus labor. I justify this with this idea of the social factory. Labor is created everywhere. Social reproduction and production in the workplace are one and the same thing. They cannot be surgically separated. And the extraction of labor takes place with many different instruments which shift, change in different historical times. One becomes more prevalent. So I would like to end the thesis with a positive note, but I decided to slash this last chapter because I need to finish with the thesis. The thesis is written now. I am at the very final stages of like polishing the argument and the text. I decided to leave out a part that is very dear to me, and at the first it was maybe the motivation for doing this thesis, which is providing my own response. But I've come to think of it, I mean, is actually like the most productive thing that you can do as a social movement activist. Is it to present a ready-made solution for people, or it is to analyze the complex relations of exploitation and their roots and leave the subject's agency? The reader also has an agency. So I leave this to the reader's agency in a sense, or this is just justification for my justification for slashing the last part of my thesis. And that's it.
Lots of material to
43 minutes.
So I'll open the floor for questions also online.
Ahead in the online people. No, thank you so much. I mean, it's always so much fun to finally hear more about colleagues' research. So I'm getting for you taking the time to give us a glimpse in what you've been doing all these years. I thought it was really interesting. What I was curious about is a little bit like more in terms of the specific context in which you work, because you showed some pictures of Athens, I think it was specifically.
Yeah.
So I was curious, like what sort of localities you were looking at within Greece, and if you saw like regional differences also in sort of this creation of a subjectivity, in how far, for example, the situation in the capital differed from, because that's something that, for example, in my field research, I saw a lot that there's this sort of this externalization of the people in Amman, in the capital, being one group, and then an antagonization of people outside of the capital who are sort of left at the mercy of. So I was wondering, like, how sort of localities and geographical differences also played a role in sort of this subjectivity that you looked at.
Yeah. I don't have a very good answer to that, in the sense that I know that this is weakness of my thesis, that I make some very general and abstract conclusions without being able to specify, because I need to work across geographical and time frames. You see, I start like maybe 100 years ago. So it's not like I'm not fine combing my arguments in this sense, but I'm interested in the urban contexts for two reasons. One is that they set the example for everyone. They set the sets of values of propriety that needs to be followed. Actually, even in smaller cities, the emulation of the petit bourgeoisie of Athens, it was the model that should be followed. And if we follow this, actually, it was called the good homes. If you follow the ways of the good homes, you can become like them. You can become middle class. You can become socially mobile. This is why the urban spaces are one of my main focuses. And the other one is because Greece, precisely because of this process of urbanization, is a very, very urbanized place, and the countryside is dying out. There's a lot of concentration of the population in urban areas, which is increasing with time, constantly. Athens, the capital, has more than half of Greece's population. It has more than 5 million people. So yeah, if I needed to like be picky about to choose one thing to study, it would be urban process.
Claude? You're still muted.
Thank you very much, Theo. It was a really wonderful presentation, and I feel like you're really done with it. And I have just a quick question. Of course, because you're done already, feel free to disregard this. But just to push it a bit further, can you hear me?
Can you hear him?
Mute yourself?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, can you hear me now? But I cannot hear you, Theo. So I don't know how you'll answer it. I cannot hear you. Can you hear me? Okay.
He's muted. Theo is muted.
Theo is muted. So
it's okay.
You can
I can
just,
hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Thank you very much, Theo. Congratulations, you're almost done. But just to probably just push it a bit further, of course, you feel free to disregard this, but I feel like I just want you to think about this idea. The crucial aspect, I think, of subjectivity, and one that organizes subjectivity or any form of theories of subjectivity, would be broadly conceived the notion of the police. Of course, you have already mentioned, for instance, Louis Althusser, you've mentioned interpellation, and even Foucault would have a what you call regulatory hypothesis, repressive hypothesis, and you have had clearly identified the police in this case that allows the subject, that enables the subject or circumscribes the subject, but there is also a subject that is self-policing, and I wonder if you were able to encounter in in your from your research this kind of specificity of what for the tenants would be audible and inaudible in this kind of relationship with capital, with value, or what is sayable or not sayable, or visible or not or invisible for that matter, in this kind of relationship with value, with the state, with the police, with the landlord, etc. Because the self-policing is what also I think circumscribes subjectivity, and that's the thing. You're also I think that this is also an attempt to come up with an interplay between structure, systems, right, and also the psyche or subjectivity or consciousness of people, which is like I'm curious about how the police, not from the outside but police from the inside, about how it circumscribe their own subjectivities or self-policing, or yeah, I hope it makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Of course, this is very central. I've resolved this in a very specific way. When you say police, you mean in Rancière's meaning of the term, right? Okay. Sorry, I cannot hear you. Did you speak?
Yeah, not just police as Rancière, but also a lot. It has ramified in different ways. Like as mentioned, I think. For instance, Butler called it like regulatory frame, interpolation by Louis Althusser, etc. So, it's not just, it's broadly conceived as a police, but self-policing in general.
I think that what I describe here are precisely this kind of self-policing subjects, in the sense that this is not an external compulsion. This is the creation of subjects that look after themselves and shape themselves into behaviors and dispositions and values that are amenable to power, of course, but they're not actively shaped by power. It's a bit like what Foucault is describing about the neoliberal governmentality. But I identify this governmentality long before neoliberalism was a thing or even a word. In the self-initiative of the Nicochyreos, who has no actual regard. The Nicochyreos, the householder, the post-Second World War subject of home ownership, who has no regard for the collective good, but who's actively shaping himself into a wealth accumulating subject. Then what is going on is, in later periods, I come to use precisely Foucault's framings of what means self-policing and the self-generating subject. We're talking about the investor subject that is totally independent from structures of support, of the welfare state, of even the family, because it's forward-looking, it's freedom-loving, it's shaping itself into the market subject. It's responding to market signals and market impulses in such a way as to maximize its own profit, its own benefit, its own utility. So this is par excellence the self-policing and self-generating subject. But when we move to the indebted subject, it's not less self-policing. It's that what is changing from my conception of the neoliberal investor subject to the indebted subject is not this internal process of policing oneself and adjusting oneself to market impulses and market processes. The only thing that changes is the promise of prosperity. You're not anymore managing yourself as human capital and yourself as a market agent in order to reach prosperity. You're managing all these things to better manage your poverty, better manage, avoid total pauperization. This is the new promise. It's not a promise of prosperity, but a promise of avoiding the wars. And this, again, it doesn't come through creating a network of protection. It doesn't come through collective solutions. It comes through self-initiative and being a market subject, through responding to the market impulses, to the debt relation in this case, taking on debt prudently and paying it back prudently. This will save you from being totally pauperized.
Just a small clarification question. You have a long historical analysis too, in also in your presentation. I was wondering, kind of your discourse analysis, where you started it, and if the discourse analysis is also about the historical periods, or if it's historical period based on kind of forming the framework of these figures of value based on literature review, and then you use that for your discourse, or how did you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I use discourse analysis throughout. It's just that for the first period, the primary material was scarce. And it was not so important that I would like dedicate a lot of my time. So I mainly did discourse analysis on primary material that other people had collected. So I delved into like theses of other people who have done interviews with homeowners of this period, on people who are collecting political speeches of the period. So it is on primary material, but not my own primary material. And then on the rest of the periods, the primary material was much more available. For the 80s, for example, I looked into the dominant discourses of the socialist project and especially of the leader and how they frame the people and the subject around it. In the 90s, I went to the newspapers that were like exalting the entrepreneurial and investing spirit of the Greeks who play in the stock market and etc. I look into television advertisements by banks and how they frame taking on debt as freedom-loving and seizing opportunity, etc. And to this day, I especially into financial press and the dominant discourse about paying one's debts, which was dominant in Greece since the 2010, with all this idea of moralizing the national debt. So we had this idea that Greece was into debt, into national debt, and deserved austerity because Greeks are inherently profligate and they're lazy, etc., which was an imported discourse from the Western media, imported into Greece and digested in various ways and in various formats. So I went a lot into financial press and how they framed the subject, the default, strategic defaulter subject. So because my framing of my instrument for discourse analysis is Laclau's theory of post-structuralist discourse analysis, which is inherently political. So it's trying to see how various types of discourses make the world around us. And when they make the world around us, they make the protagonists, the villains, the opposing camps, different identities come together, which do not necessarily share a lot, but through discourse, they're made to share things through establishing the constitutive outside. And dislocation is also a central category here, because dislocation is the moment when a discourse comes to its limits. It cannot explain things anymore. There is an event that falls totally outside of the capacity of a discourse to explain it. So you need a shift. You need a shift in discourse. Previous identities within the discourse are destabilized, so everyone needs to re-identify. And this is the moment that generates shifts, generates change. And generates change, often this feeds back into economic processes as well, because economic processes are also discursive processes, and they're founded on discourses on how value is based. When these discourses stop working, you need to find new ways to extract value and new narratives to justify why extracting value this way is important. So this is my methodology altogether, and this is I've used it throughout my thesis.
Those were the moments of dislocation you mentioned in the beginning.
The moments of dislocation are precisely the way I separate historical periods. Of course, there are minor dislocations within this, but the major dislocations are the way how we pass from one historical period to the next. Also, there is a hand on there.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can start online.
No, it's you were before, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I have a small question. If you take gender into account in your thesis, in the presentation, you mentioned at the start also this idea of the conservative home-owning family man, where you say man, but when you talk about the role of housing and in social reproduction, the role of women who are often not owners also matters a lot.
Totally. I say family man because precisely this is a gender role. Νοικοκυρέος only exists with this meaning in the masculine gender in Greece. If you say νοικοκυρά, which is the feminine form of the word, it means a different thing. It means a homemaker. So this is a gendered subject position from the scratch. However, this exists within a mode of familist accumulation, which is, there is a whole, I go into the whole discussion about welfare regimes and welfare systems, because there's a whole discussion on what a familist welfare system is, that does not rely on state welfare, but through like prudent saving and family accumulation, the family can provide for its members. And it's a welfare system that was prevalent in the European periphery, especially in the Mediterranean, up until recently, and still is to an extent. So the role of the woman there was paramount. It was not less important than the man's. She had to acquire the appropriate subject positions in order, because she had to be calculative to manage the resources of the house, and especially to manage the status symbols of the house. So the subject position that I present is part of a whole other, I mean, there's no separation between this and the whole other means of ways of reproduction. And of course, further down the line, I go into how these shifts affect social reproduction in general, but maybe they were not here in the presentation. Or maybe now that you say that you said it, I need to emphasize them more in my text, so that was a good cue.
Nikos, do you have a question?
Yes. Hey everyone, thank you Theo for this really illuminating presentation. You are covering a very big historical trajectory, and that you introduce different concepts and different ideas and try to weave them together. So I will stand in one of the concepts that you used in the last part of your presentation, the social factory. I am really interested to know how this fits into your research. and with what other constellations of concepts you combine this social factory idea. It's something that came up in the post-operaismo period, and I was wondering, is this like the idea you in general conceptualize value appropriation, or is it like a turning point, is a passage from like a value produced in the factory and value expanding in outside the sphere of factory? And is this something that you identify happening in Greece in a specific period, if that's so, or is it something that was like even previously happening in Greece? And I'm saying that because you referred to it in the last part of the presentation. So, yeah.
Yeah. This is a very good question and a difficult one, because yeah, I'm still in the process of bringing together all this theoretical framework into a coherent whole, because I don't want to be cherry picking like ideas from different and conflicting theoretical frameworks. So I need to be able to integrate them all into one. So unfortunately, I've used a Bourdieuian way of identifying class and class formation processes. And then I use Laclau with the discourse to identify all the process of antagonism. And then I try to integrate all this into a post-workerist conception of labor, of value, and of social reproduction, which is creating a bit of headache. But it's not as incompatible as it may initially seem. Because, I mean, if I go into the details, I think that if you take a post-workerist conception of class, which has three components: the technical composition of class, the political composition of class, and the social composition of class. Are you familiar at all with the post-workerist framework? Anyway, so the technical composition of class is how relations of production turn people into class subjects. The political composition of class is how a class becomes a class in itself, and it's taking conscience of its existence. And the social composition of class is precisely that all this rests on processes of social reproduction that cannot be abstracted for processes of production. This is the workerist framework. So this idea of the social composition of class is not incompatible for me with the way I conceptualize class. I just use Bourdieu because his ideas of distinction, demarcation, symbolic demarcation of classes, and symbolic struggle was very, very relevant for my work in identifying how we come into different conceptions of class in different periods. So I'm standing up because I move my hands a lot and I'm afraid of it. Right. So now coming on to the question, sorry, I've veered off. I don't believe that this is a specific stage. So the social factory, okay. The social factory is the idea that value is not created in the factory, because social reproduction processes and production processes are inseparable. They depend on one another. If you say that value is just what the capitalist appropriates after the market transaction, this the surplus value they takes away from the labor of the laborer, it's just a part of the picture, very relevant part of the picture, and very, very appropriate for describing specific historical and current processes. But yeah, but only a tiny percentage of the world population is in wage labor relations. All the rest are producing value that capital appropriates, but in different ways. And I don't think that this is a new stage. It has always been like that. There are many different instruments of appropriating value, and I identify four here. Identify the wage relationship, debt, rent and tax. The tax is a bit heretic. It's an idea by Maurizio Lazzarato that these are different modalities of appropriation within capitalism. Capitalism shifts between these wherever the other one is not working. All of them are happening at the same time, one becomes dominant. For example, in Greece, in the 2010s, the labor relation broke down because there was huge industrialization, closure of businesses, huge unemployment rates, surplus populations all over. So the capital was not reasonably expecting to make money out of the wage relation primarily. Debt became a new way of accumulation for financial capital. And what enabled this way of accumulation, says Lazzarato, is tax. Taxes went up, they were generalized, property taxes sextupled, taxes went disproportionately high in relation to incomes, according to the statistics. Why? Because taxes were a mechanism of extraction of wealth from society in order to be able to repay the debt. And that was the main instrument of wealth extraction, and to this day it remains so. So post-war, sorry, the plumber. Finally, I've been waiting for the plumber for 3 weeks and just goes to now. Yeah, no.
Next year, then.
So, where am I? The idea that surplus value is generalized in every interaction is found in post-workerists, such as Negri. So Negri says, okay, I'm not very fond of the immaterial labor idea that suddenly we have gone to a stage of immaterial labor where the bulk of labor is made with our heads and the material labor cannot be quantified. That's why you can, labor theory of value of Marx is not valid anymore. I think that labor theory of Marx of value is not valid anymore, but not because now we're all immaterial laborers. It's because we're always immaterial laborers. All value ever was based on collaboration, on collective processes, on ideas that were generated by other people or knowledge that was generated from other people. Value creation has always been yes? Yes, yes. Dritorek and Strat 43. There is someone there to open for you. I'm not at home, but my wife is. Okay? Thank you. 3 weeks I've been waiting for this man. And you called me during my presentation.
If you didn't hang up, you would have left.
Yeah. Good that you picked up.
Yeah. So anyway, sorry. So what I was saying is that value has always been a collaborative effort, and it depends on social reproduction in the widest sense possible. Of course, on gendered labor, which is a big part of the social reproduction, but wider process of social reproduction that outside of this gendered labor. Okay, so capital needs. So first, the labor theory of value is individualizing this labor, saying that the worker is producing this labor and the capitalist takes it away because takes away the surplus labor. But it was not the worker's value. It was value produced by so many different people. And second, if capital is to extract labor, extract value, which is its essence, it needs many different instruments in doing so. And this is where the social factory goes. So Negri has this argument that finance is not just some new thing that capitalism has invented that is sidelining the previous industrial activity. Finance is just a mode of appropriation that is adapted to the social factory. I can make money, I can extract wealth from all of your activities because you're now dependent on debt for everything. You're dependent on debt to retain your standard of living, or even to for the surplus populations who have no place in production, they're everywhere, and especially in Greece, this is pretty self-evident. A great part of the population does not have a part in production or in consumption. Assuming debt, the debt-fair industry, as Soderbergh frames it, is important for their actual survival. And the way of capital of making money out of people who are not under their direct command in their workplace is financialization, is debt. So I'm not saying that there is a new distinctive phase in capitalism, but it is an instrument that acquires protagonism in moments such as this, where industrial production is not enough for capital to extract value.
You mentioned that you may not have like a positive or on a positive note, and I was wondering if, because you obviously were talking about these quarters as a subject,
Yeah.
But you start saying that housing is an instrument of government and domination, I suppose, but it could also be an instrument of resistance. And I guess these quarters bring that. So I was wondering if that could be something interesting to look into, or to expand in the conclusion to. And in other words, that housing is not only a place of speculation, but also has been like the space where we're making different forms of politics. The other thing is that when we were talking about, I found it very interesting. It feels like I didn't read your work, but it feels like we're doing like the social history of housing in Greece. We're like establish all these main subjects. And when you talk about the proprietary subject, property subject, and what does it mean? I felt like the way you describe it is as if it's like a neoliberalism before its the time. And whether it would be interesting to actually discuss this too, because yeah, I mean, the way that time operates is not linear, and many of the elements, right, of let's think of neoliberalism, find its roots before the historical time when they're locating the rise of neoliberal policies. So it's immediately we're describing it, but this is neoliberal thinking of managing individuals and economic behavior. And the last part, my last comment is like I found it very interesting when you talk about this impossibility of separating exploitation from labor from these other areas of appropriation in capitalism. And I mean, specifically because if you think about what are labor reforms or what are small changes in the tax of interest, or what are, thinking even small changes in the price of food and how it affects the amount of income that is extracted from workers, natural payment in food in their social reproduction. So it's very interesting, and I think and I was wondering if you have other examples in the Greek case on how these are deeply connected, because I think if you look, you're going to see that each of these dimensions, smaller changes there from certain actors are sometimes actors who are also in the realm of production, operating exploitation of labor. So I was just thinking in these terms, like if you're going to bring more examples, but it's definitely, it would be really interesting to bring more elements, I guess.
So there's more.
Yeah, but it's red, I think so. Yeah, I was just curious if you have more examples, because I guess you can really show it through small things. is interconnected.
Let me start from the second question, and it's a good opportunity to give a shout out to my friend Nikos, who just asked the previous question. Nikos is my thinking partner and also my social movement partner, and I'm very happy that he's here. And also this idea of avant la lettre neoliberalism is one that we have been discussing with Nikos for many, many years. So I dug into this a bit. This idea, in my thesis, I give a timeline of liberalism and how it has been constructing this idea of the sovereign property subject as like the center of liberal polities, and how, of course, this was the center of race and class differentiations, and how this was forged in the colonies through the differentiation of the sovereign, reasonable man from the wild savage. So I don't see it as disconnected from the discussion. It's an extension, which is in Greece particularly, the system of reconstruction differed radically than in the north of Europe, where there was a proper welfare state, precisely because Greece was devastated and in extreme need of economic support, and the USA stepped in with a Marshall Plan. And according to the terms of the Marshall Plan, Greece became an experiment in reconstruction, not relying on state initiative. So this model of the self-assisted housing was the brainchild of American consultants as a part of the Marshall Plan, because Greece had a history of civil war and a lot of mobilization and a lot of strife over social justice. So they wanted a totally different plan for Greece than they needed for other countries which had not had a civil war after the Second World War. They needed to boost, to cultivate these characteristics of self-initiative and self-responsibility, and they thought that establishing a welfare state would be equating to communism. We're in a context of anti-communism in the Cold War. So this is the root of the Nicokyraios mentality to a great extent. And that's why it has common roots with neoliberalism. It is the same matrix. Around the same time were the meetings of the Mont Peregrine Society that established the tenets of neoliberalism. So it is avant la lettre in the sense that neoliberalism was not called this back then and was not implemented as we know it because there were Keynesian 40th years, but it is the same matrix that gave birth to this.
Just a small note, but one thing that might be useful moving forward, and not for the thesis, but if you want to publish more on this, there are a lot of similarities with what you're discussing here and what happened in Flanders after the Second World War. So while Belgium as a whole was considered a welfare state because of the destruction in Belgium after both of the world wars and because of the inter-communist strife between the Flemish and the Wallonian population, the Marshall Plan actually also used sort of this idea of home ownership, specifically for the rural populations, to strengthen sort of a conservative and a lot, I think even in terms of like urban policies in like ownership, and if you look at sort of the way that urban centers have not been planned in Belgium, specifically in Flanders, you will see a lot of similarities between Greece and Flanders. Because of the Marshall.
That's really, really interesting. I haven't thought of it before.
It's absolutely uncanny. And there's a lot of links also with rural policies, specifically here in Flanders, of the Conservative Party, which was anchored in the rural backbone in Flanders, which very much stimulated this idea of this mindset that you had of sort of the family man having to. So there's a lot of very interesting, very striking self-built homes, Yeah, poteré. I mean, it's really the bricolage. There's a lot of things that I think are
In general.
Polish as a sort of a studying
Whereas also
course.
you have these revolting peasants.
Yeah,
So you have to make them landowners.
in order to
Also
sort of
what was
pacify
done in
them.
Japan, in the Philippines,
Yeah,
in so many
yeah.
places that were pivotal for the United States and Southeast Asia, for instance. Because I mean, you have to get rid of this feudal land-owning elite. You have to make peasants landowners,
Yeah,
and
the
then it
same
becomes
in Norway.
entrepreneurial class almost. So I think, yeah, there's a lot to say. The idea of
Yeah, yeah,
ownership
of course.
has always been a very crucial one, and make them owners.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
If you know anyone who's working on this subject in Flanders, I would be really like happy to meet them. Yeah, it's not right now. Yeah. It's time, huh?
Yeah.
So sorry, I'm gonna answer the other two questions in private. Okay?
Yeah, of course, we continue the discussion for those who want with some lunch in the lounge or and that we ended here for today. Thank you very much, Theo, for your presentation.
Thank you,
for
guys.
everyone
Thank you,
to
Arthur.
give input. It's really nice to get to know each other's work and to have that feedback on your work. So thank you all for being here and participating. Next one is in January.
The FW ones, right?
So there's one, and there's also a presentation of Beirut.
Δεν σ'
The
ακούω,
first
Τέο.
one, 22nd.
Let's take a break.
Εγώ ευχαριστώ για την πρόσκληση. Πολύ ωραία παρουσίαση. Θα τα πούμε αργότερα.
Κανένα.
Historian,